As KWTX celebrates Black History Month, we are reminded that African Americans play a strong role in government, and they've been doing so since Reconstruction.
Tonight, Keisha Lopez takes a look at 6 black lawmakers who helped shape our state, right here from Central Texas.
Reconstruction, that turbulent time after the American Civil War, was focused on reintegrating southern states into the Union. Slavery had been abolished and African Americans were free to build communities, and the men got the right to vote. With that came the election of 52 blacks who served on the state and even federal levels. Right now, Texas is working with local historical commissions to individually recognize these men in the districts they served with markers. 6 were from Central Texas. All were Republican, all served in the Texas House during the 12th legislative session for 3 years. In late 1869, voters from Robertson, Leon, and Freestone counties elected Silas, sometimes recorded as Giles Cotton. He served on the Agriculture and Stock Raising Committee, and he also served on Privileges and Elections Committee. He supported legislation that made Calvert, where he lived, the Robertson County seat. David Medlock Jr. represented Limestone, Falls, and McLennan counties in the House. He was on the Federal Relations Committee. He sponsored a bill that incorporated his hometown, Springfield, and sought the return of taxes to Limestone County to build a jail. He also joined the Radical Republican Association. D.W. Burley represented Robertson, Leon, and Freestone counties. He was a free black man before the end of slavery, and in 1864 was a captain in a battalion of black soldiers that defended St. Louis from Confederate raiders. He arrived in Texas in '65 and later organized a debating society for blacks. He too served in the House. Shepard Mullins was a former slave who called McLennan County home. During Reconstruction, he was tapped to serve on the board that registered voters. He served on the platform committee for the first Republican Party convention. He also served in the Constitutional Convention of 1868-69. Later, a 4-year term as McLennan County Commissioner, Mullins even became a vice president of the convention. So Mullins campaigned for and also won a place in the Texas House of Representatives, the 12th legislature. He strongly supported Republican efforts to protect the interests of black people. That included establishing the Texas State Police and a militia to control violence. He also voted for a state system of education available to all citizens. He introduced a bill to extend the Waco city limits. Mullins is now buried at the First Street Cemetery in Waco. John Mitchell, a former slave whose property holdings valued at more than $3,700, was the wealthiest black member of the 12th legislative session. So Mitchell represented Burleson, Brazos, and Milam counties in the House. He sat on the Public Land Committee. He joined the Radical Republican Association, organized to uphold the governor's vetoes of railroad development bills. Mitchell also represented Burleson and Washington counties in the 14th legislature, and he was a member of the Penitentiary Committee. Ralph Long was a delegate to the Constitutional Convention of 1868-69. It's believed he was the son of a white father and a black mother, though it's unclear if he was ever a slave. Long was elected to the convention by voters from Limestone, Navarro, and Hill counties. He voted for a proposal that would have divided Texas into more than one state. He also proposed a resolution that voided debts incurred with Confederate currency and that resulted in the purchase of slaves. That didn't happen. He also supported measures that would have prevented voter fraud and intimidation. In March of 2010, the state unveiled a monument dedicated to these black Reconstruction lawmakers. It sits in the Texas State Cemetery in Austin. All but a few of these Central Texas men now have their own markers in their own districts where they served. The others are to come. These men are some of the many reasons KWTX salutes Black History Month.
A huge thank you to the Texas State Library and Archives Commission and to Keisha for that story. Also the Texas State Historical Association for preserving and sharing our Texas history.
We'll be right back with sports.